Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know how we often talk about those classic shows and movies, the ones from what people often call the Golden Age?
Mm-hmm. The ones people still love watching.
Exactly. Well, today, we're actually going a little beyond our usual scope, but I think you'll find it just as fascinating. We're taking a deep dive into 1950s America itself. You know, the real world behind those shows.
Ah, the context. Very important.
Right. We're not just looking at the families on screen, but the complex realities, the huge shifts, and maybe some of the quiet struggles that really define that decade.
It's a period people think they know, but often just the surface.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
So we've pulled together historical texts, some really interesting census data, academic analyses, trying to get a comprehensive view.
Good stuff.
Our mission basically is to peel back that sort of shiny nostalgic layer and really understand what was going on underneath. It gets painted as this simple, prosperous time, but it was definitely more nuanced. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is how foundational the 50s were. So much of how we understand American life, even now, has roots in the shifts that happened in that single decade.
That makes sense.
It laid the groundwork for so much that came after. And, thinking about the media, how those Goldie Age shows both reflected and really powerfully shaped the society, it's a feedback loop.
Understanding the 50s helps understand modern America, basically.
Absolutely. You can't really grasp one without the other.
Okay, so, starting point. When you picture the 50s, I think for most of us, the image that comes up is that, that perfect nuclear family.
The sitcom family, right. Mom, dad, 2.5 kids, white picket fence.
Exactly. But how much of that was the actual reality versus, an ideal people were aiming for?
Well, the numbers do show that the structure was dominant. Our sources say married couples made up, something like 87% of U.S. households in 1950? That's huge.
87%, wow.
Yeah, the vast majority.
And then there's the baby boom. Not just a catchy phrase, right? It was a massive demographic wave.
Oh, enormous. The sources highlight the sheer numbers. About 31% of the population was under 18 in 1950, and that number actually climbed to 34% by 1970.
A third of the country being kids or teens. That must have reshaped everything. Schools, infrastructure.
Completely. For decades. It's hard to overstate the impact of that demographic bulge.
And tied into that family structure were, pretty specific gender roles, right?
Very specific, often quite rigid. The sources really dig into this happy homemaker image for women.
Yeah.
Now, about 29% of working-age women did have paid jobs, but that number dropped sharply for married women, only about 21%.
So the expectation was clearly for married women to be at home.
Overwhelmingly. Society pushed this idea hard. The whole concept of women going to college to get an MRS degree, as they sometimes joked.
A degree in finding a husband, basically.
Pretty much. Career ambitions for women weren't really encouraged in the mainstream. And if women did work, the options were, quite limited.
What kind of jobs?
Things like teaching, nursing, secretarial work, clerical stuff, librarianship, maybe an airline stewardess. Very typecast roles.
And the men.
Expected to be the sole breadwinner. That was the model. Post-war stability the man provides.
Okay. And inside the home, parenting was changing too. You mentioned Dr. Spock earlier.
Yeah, Dr. Benjamin Spock's book, Baby and Child Care from 1946, was massively influential throughout the 50s. His message was basically, trust yourself as parents, comfort crying babies.
That sounds normal now, but was it radical then?
It was a big shift, moving away from stricter, more detached parenting styles towards something warmer, more child-centered. It fit with that focus on the family and kids.
So a cultural shift inside the home alongside this baby boom, driving changes outside, like in education.
Exactly. You saw near universal K-12 schooling become the norm, and high school enrollment just skyrocketed. Schools were scrambling to keep up with all those baby boomers.
And amidst all that growth, there was a huge legal change, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
A landmark decision, absolutely. It officially began the process, the very slow and difficult process, of desegregating public schools, a massive challenge to the Jim Crow style.
So that's happening alongside this educational expansion. And the GI Bill was still having a big impact, too.
Oh, undeniably. It was still enabling millions of veterans to go to college. This created a much more educated workforce than before the war.
And that fed into middle-class aspirations.
Yeah.
Like the idea that you could get an education, a good job.
Absolutely. It fueled that upward mobility, that dream of a better life, which tied directly into another massive shift.
Which was?
Mass suburbanization, moving out of the cities.
Ah, yes. The suburbs.
Government programs like FHA and VA loans combined with the GI Bill benefits suddenly made owning a home affordable for millions. especially young families.
So people were leaving the cities.
In droves. The sources show a dramatic rise in homeownership. It went from about 44% in 1940 to 62% by 1960.
Wow, nearly two-thirds owning homes. That's a fundamental change.
It is, and the suburban population itself grew massively from maybe 20% of Americans in 1940 to over 30% by 1960.
And places like Levittown became the symbols of this.
Exactly. These huge, developer-driven communities, often built very quickly, very uniformly, mainly for veterans and their families. A whole new landscape.
Compared to what? Older city housing?
Yeah, older, denser urban housing, often apartments or row houses or, rural areas with older farmhouses, some of which, especially early in the 50s, still lacked things like modern plumbing or central heating.
So a new house in the suburbs felt like a huge step up, a whole new lifestyle.
It really did.
Okay, so families are changing, homes are changing location. What about work? How did people actually make a living in the 50s? What was that culture like?
Well, economically, the 1950s were largely seen as a workers' boom. Industrial production was incredibly high.
Manufacturing was king.
Manufacturing and service jobs, yeah. But one really interesting trend the sources point out is the big decline in farming.
Because of machines.
Exactly. Mechanization meant fewer people were needed on farms. Only about 12% of the workforce were farmers by then, which was a huge drop.
Where did those people go?
Many migrated former farm families moving to cities, and especially the growing suburbs, looking for factory work or, increasingly, office jobs.
Okay, so factories and offices are where the jobs are, and unions were strong then.
Very strong. Union membership actually peaked around 1954. This collective bargaining power often meant better wages, benefits, more security for many industrial workers. It helps solidify that middle-class status.
And this leads to that idea of the organization man.
Yeah, that term became popular in 56. It really captured the corporate culture of the time, a culture of, conformity.
How so?
Employees often wore suits, very standardized look. They joined company clubs, socialized within the company structure. There was this expectation of loyalty, often staying with one employer for your whole career. Blend in, climb the ladder slowly.
And office work itself was growing.
Rapidly. Think about all the new technologies filtering in, telephones becoming ubiquitous, early business machines. You needed people to operate them. Typists, switchboard operators. These became really common jobs, especially for women entering the workforce.
Right.
It's interesting, by the late 50s, even in factories, something like 30% of the workers were actually clerical staff. Managing the paperwork, the logistics, a sort of quiet white-collar expansion even within blue-collar industries.
That's fascinating. And again, gender roles really shaped who did what, right?
Absolutely. You can't escape it. Men were overwhelmingly in the higher-paying roles, engineers, salesmen, managers, government positions.
And the census data backs this up.
Clearly. Women, as we said, were clustered. Teaching, nursing, secretarial jobs, some service industry roles, defined spheres. It directly mirrored that happy homemaker ideal we talked about.
Okay, so the home, the workplace,
Yeah.
drastically changing. But what about the stuff in the home, the technology people lived with?
Yeah. That's where you see another revolution. The 1950s didn't just change how we live, but with what we lived.
Appliances and electronics taking off.
Massively. But the absolute king was television.
Right, you mentioned the numbers earlier. From 12% ownership in 1950 to 87% by 1960.
It's just staggering. Think about that impact in just 10 years. It fundamentally changed leisure time, family dynamics, politics, everything.
And other appliances were booming too.
Oh, yeah. The sources estimate millions and millions sold by mid-century, 20 million refrigerators, 5.5 million stoves, 5 million washing machines by 1950 alone.
Wow. So these went from luxuries to standard household items very quickly.
Exactly. It was about achieving a new standard of modern living. And new stuff was appearing too. Clothes dryers, home freezers, built-in dishwashers were starting to come onto the market.
And even food changed to fit this new lifestyle.
Yeah. Things like Tupperware, which was invented in 48, became huge for storing food. And then TV dinners launched in 1954.
Made for eating in front of the TV.
Precisely. It all fit together. Telephone service was also expanding rapidly, connecting more and more homes.
Any really high-tech stuff starting then.
Well, on the cutting edge, you had the first commercial computers. UNIVAC being delivered to the U.S. Census Bureau in 1951 was a huge milestone. Showed electronic data processing was viable, the seeds of the digital age.
Okay, so inside the home is transforming. What about getting around? Transportation.
Another massive change, the rise of car culture.
Driven by.
Cheap gas, for one. But crucially, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, that federal project started building the massive highway network we have today.
Connecting cities, enabling commutes from those new suburbs.
Exactly. It literally paved the way for suburban sprawl and made long-distance driving much easier. Car ownership just soared, from about 54% of families having a car in 48 to 74% by 59.
Another huge jump, nearly 3/4 of families?
Yeah. The car became central to the American way of life. And air travel was changing too, though maybe less immediately impactful for the average person.
How so?
The start of commercial jet travel. The Boeing 707 started flying passengers in 1958. Suddenly, crossing the country took hours instead of days. It began shrinking the world.
So faster cars, faster planes, a faster pace of life starting.
In many ways, yes. And other key advances too. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine in 1955 was monumental.
Wiped out a terrifying disease.
A huge public health victory. You also had the first general-purpose credit cards issued around 1950.
The start of buy now, pay later.
Pretty much. And transistor radios made music portable for the first time. All these little things added up.
And the big picture consequence.
Well, the sources point out that by the late 50s, Americans were only about 6% of the world's population, but were consuming something like a third of the world's goods and services.
Wow. A consumer powerhouse.
Unprecedented material abundance for a large portion of the population.
Wait, this next part is a real gem for you, our listener, especially given your usual interests. How did pop culture in the 50s reflect all this? And maybe shape it too?
The fun stuff.
Let's start with music. Mid-50s, something big happened.
Rock and roll exploded onto the scene. Yeah. Around 1954, maybe 55.
What was it?
This incredible, energetic mix of rhythm and blues, which had primarily black audiences, and country and Western music. Artists like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, they just blew the doors open.
And it was controversial.
Hugely controversial. Parents were often horrified. It sounded raw, rebellious. It came with this whole new rebellious youth image, too.
Leather jackets, poodle skirts.
Exactly. Teenagers finally had their own music, their own style. It was a major cultural marker separating generations.
And TV brought this right into the living room.
Television became the dominant entertainment force. Variety shows like The Ed Sullivan Show were huge platforms. Elvis appearing on Sullivan was a national event.
And sitcoms. I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners.
Yeah, massively popular. They became shared cultural touchstones. And many shows like Father Knows Best or The Goldbergs really portrayed and reinforced those middle-class family ideals we talked about.
Sometimes maybe a bit too ideally.
Often, yes. They presented a certain version of American life, often smoothing over the complexities or ignoring the disparities, but they were incredibly influential in shaping perceptions of the norm.
What about movies? Hollywood.
Hollywood was adapting to TV, but still huge. Big stars, big musicals like Singin' in the Rain, teen dramas reflecting that new youth culture like Rebel Without a Cause.
James Dean, Marilyn Monroe.
Absolute icons. Their images were everywhere, defining glamour, rebellion, the whole spectrum of 50s stardom.
And fashion reflected these trends.
Oh, definitely. Women's fashion was heavily influenced by Christian Dior's new look from the late 40s, that nipped waist, full skirt silhouette.
Very feminine, yes.
Day dresses, twin-set sweaters for a more casual look. And for teens, those poodle skirts became iconic.
And men's fashion.
More conservative for business dark suits, fedora hats were still common. But for younger guys, you saw that greaser look, leather jackets, jeans, or maybe cardigan sweaters for a more preppy style. A bit of a split reflecting conformity and budding rebellion.
Okay, what about how people spent their free time? Leisure.
Sports were huge. Baseball was definitely still the national pastime. The New York Yankees were dominant, won 5 straight World Series from 49 to 53.
People followed that closely.
Oh, yeah. On the radio, increasingly on TV. And families had more leisure time, more disposable income. So, drive-in movie theaters boomed.
Right. Perfect for car culture.
Exactly. Attending ball games, visiting amusement parks. Bowling became incredibly popular. Bowling alleys were major social centers. And those new suburban shopping centers started popping up. Places to hang out, shop, spend money.
All part of that expanding consumer lifestyle.
Dive right into it.
Okay, let's bring this all together. What was the actual financial reality, the economy underpinning all these changes?
By almost every measure, the 1950s was a period of incredible economic boom. Real GDP grew really fast, about 4.2% per year on average.
And inflation.
Pretty low, remarkably stable, around 2.5% annually. Unemployment was also historically low, averaging maybe 4 or 5%.
So the economy was just humming along.
It really was. The U.S. economy more than doubled in size compared to 1940. It was a period of sustained growth unlike anything seen before.
And that meant rising incomes.
Steadily rising wages and salaries, yeah. The average family income around 1950 was about $3,300. That might not sound like much now, but with low inflation, it provided real purchasing power.
Enough to buy those appliances, maybe a car.
Exactly. It fueled that consumer culture we keep coming back to. Americans became incredibly enthusiastic buyers. Fridges, stoves, washing machines, millions sold every year.
And cars and TVs went from luxuries to norms.
Absolutely. Over 5 million TVs were sold in 1955 alone. It shows how fast that saturation happened. And this was all lubricated by the explosion of credit.
Installment buying, those new credit cards.
Yeah, that buy now, pay later mentality really took hold. Mass marketing and advertising were pushing people constantly. Upgrade your car, get the latest gadget.
So connecting this growth back to the people, it broadened the middle class.
Significantly. That combination of rising wages, government support, like the GI Bill for education and housing, it really did lift millions of families, including many working-class families, into what was considered a middle-class lifestyle.
Owning a home in the suburbs, the car, the appliances, that became the attainable dream for many.
For many, yes. By 1950, maybe half of all families were earning between $2,000 and $5,000 a year, which was generally enough for that comfortable suburban life.
Like, there's always a but, isn't there? Was everyone included in this prosperity?
And that's the crucial point we have to make. If we really want to understand the 50s, we have to talk about the disparities. It wasn't a golden age for everyone.
Who was left out?
Well, economists estimate that despite the boom, somewhere around 20 to 25% of Americans still lived in poverty throughout the decade.
A quarter of the population. That's significant.
It is. And poverty wasn't evenly distributed. It disproportionately affected African Americans who faced systemic segregation and discrimination, especially in inner cities, but also in the rural South, and also many rural whites, particularly in areas like Appalachia.
So the boom didn't reach everywhere.
Not at all. Many inner cities actually declined as wealthier residents left for the suburbs, and many rural counties saw very little benefit. Life there often continued with substandard housing, poorly funded schools, very limited job opportunities.
And this poverty was sort of hidden from view?
Largely invisible, yeah, especially to the increasingly prosperous suburban majority. It created this kind of dual reality, which is why, when we look back, we have to ask who benefited from the prosperity and who was left behind. The popular image often glosses over that completely.
That's such an important layer to add. So quite a journey we've taken from that idealized family image and the suburban dream through the changing world of work, the tech revolution, the pop culture explosion.
Rock and roll and TV.
Right. And finally grappling with the economic reality, that incredible boom, but also the persistent poverty underneath.
Yeah, it paints a much richer, much more complex picture.
That's right. The 1950s was clearly far more complicated than that simple, nostalgic image often suggests. And its influence. Well, it lasted, didn't it? Shaping so much of what came next.
Undeniably. So many trends that define modern America either started or accelerated dramatically in the 50s. And thinking about that golden age image, the one we see in media from the time, or even later nostalgia, it often simplifies things, right? It might leave out the struggles, the inequalities, the complexities we've been talking about, which really raises a key question for us, looking back at any era's public gems.
What's that?
How much of the full picture, the real societal context, are we actually seeing? And how much is just, a reflection of an ideal or maybe just one part of the story?
That's a great point. So maybe next time you, our listener, rewatch one of those classic shows from the 50s, think about what's not on screen. Consider those invisible forces we talked about, the economy, the move to the suburbs, the changing roles, the tech, the inequalities.
The whole world around the characters.
Exactly. What hidden details, what new layers of meaning might you spot now, knowing a bit more about the complex reality of 1950s America?